It's a symbol of wealth, a status that billionaires, movie stars, and world leaders wear proudly on their wrist. But what if I told you, this billion-dollar empire started not in Switzerland, not in a luxurious palace, but with a young orphan struggling to survive in Germany more than a century ago? This is the untold story of Rolex, the watch that became more than just a timepiece. It became time itself. Rolex. Just hearing the name sparks images of yachts, red carpets, and success. But behind the gold and diamonds lies a story of struggle, vision, and relentless pursuit of perfection. Unlike most luxury brands that were born out of wealth, Rolex began with a boy who had nothing, but a dream that time could be measured not just with accuracy, but with prestige. Today, Rolex sells over 1 million watches every year, generating billions in revenue. But to understand how this empire rose, we must travel back to 1881 when Hans Wilsdorf was born in a small German town. A boy who would one day reshape the entire watch industry. Hans Wilsdorf was born in Kulmbach, Germany, in 1881. His childhood was far from glamorous. By the time he was just 12 years old, tragedy struck. Both of his parents had passed away, leaving him orphaned. Imagine this. While other children were worrying about school exams, Hans was worrying about survival. But instead of breaking him, this loss gave him an unshakable determination. He learned early that life was short and time was everything. At the age of 19, Hans took his first job in a watchmaking company, not in Switzerland, but in La Chaux-de-Fonds, the very heart of the watch industry. He worked as a clerk, carefully handling precision watch parts, inspecting them with an eye for detail that most people overlooked. Here's the twist. Hans wasn't a watchmaker by training. He wasn't crafting gears or polishing dials. But he had something even rarer, a vision. He believed that watches were not just tools. They were personal statements. And at a time when pocket watches dominated, Hans dreamed of something radical, a watch you could wear on your wrist. This might sound normal today. Everyone wears wristwatches or smartwatches. But in the early 1900s, wristwatches were considered impractical, even feminine. Real men carried pocket watches. That was the belief. But Hans saw the future differently. He believed that one day, everyone would want a wristwatch. Not just for convenience, but for style, identity, and even power. This bold vision would one day lead to Rolex. But first, Hans needed to prove himself in a world that thought he was crazy. By the early 1900s, Hans Wilsdorf was restless. He had the vision, but not yet the platform. In 1905, he moved to London and started a company with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis. Together, they imported Swiss watch movements and placed them in high-quality English cases. The company's name, Wilsdorf and Davis. Not exactly catchy, right? But this was just the beginning. Hans understood one thing. If he wanted to succeed, his brand needed to stand out. It needed a name that was short, powerful, and easy to pronounce in any language. Something universal, like time itself. And so, after experimenting with hundreds of possibilities, Hans settled on one word: Rolex. He later claimed the name simply came to him, as if whispered in his ear. Simple, elegant, memorable. The birth of Rolex had arrived. In 1908, Rolex was officially registered in Switzerland. Unlike other brands, Rolex didn't chase ornamentation. Hans was obsessed with precision and practicality. His goal, to make the wristwatch, which at the time was still seen as a novelty, respected as a serious timekeeping instrument. Rolex became the first brand to earn a Swiss certificate of chronometric precision, awarded by the official watch rating center in Bienne. This was revolutionary. For the first time, a wristwatch was recognized for its accuracy, competing with pocket watches. But Hans wasn't done. He believed the wristwatch wasn't just for women or casual wear. It could be for men, for soldiers, for professionals. And history was about to prove him right. When World War I broke out in 1914, soldiers needed practicality. Pulling out a pocket watch in the middle of a battlefield wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Wristwatches suddenly became essential. British officers began strapping watches to their wrists, and Rolex was right there to meet the demand. By the end of the war, the stigma was gone. Wristwatches were no longer feminine. They were a symbol of bravery, precision, and survival. Hans Wilsdorf's bold prediction had come true. The world was finally ready for the wristwatch revolution. But Rolex wasn't just about selling watches. Hans understood the power of reputation. Every Rolex had to stand for perfection. To him, the smallest flaw was unacceptable. He invested heavily in advertising, something most watchmakers ignored. Rolex ads began appearing in newspapers, boasting about their certificates of precision. This was unheard of at the time. The message was clear. Rolex is not just a watch. It's the world's most accurate timepiece. And slowly, that message began to stick. Rolex was climbing, but Hans knew the journey was only beginning. His next invention would not just change Rolex. It would change watchmaking forever. By the 1920s, Rolex was gaining recognition. But there was still a problem. Wristwatches were delicate. Dust, humidity, and water could destroy them. Hans Wilsdorf knew that if he wanted Rolex to dominate, his watches had to survive anything. Rain, sweat, even a swim. But how do you protect a tiny machine of gears and springs from the elements? That question kept Hans awake at night. In 1926, Rolex unveiled something extraordinary, the Oyster case. It was the world's first truly waterproof wristwatch, a hermetically sealed case that protected the movement from dust and water. The name came naturally, like an oyster shell. It was nearly impossible for anything to get inside. But Hans wasn't just an inventor, he was a marketing genius. To prove his watch was waterproof, he needed more than a lab test. He needed a spectacle. Enter Mercedes Gleitzer, a young British swimmer attempting to cross the English Channel. Hans struck a deal. She would wear a Rolex Oyster during her swim. The media went wild. Newspapers covered every moment of her daring attempt. Though the freezing waters forced her to abandon the crossing after 10 hours, her Rolex kept ticking perfectly. The next day, Rolex took out a full-page newspaper ad. The Rolex Oyster, the wonder watch that defies the elements. It was a stroke of genius. Overnight, Rolex wasn't just a watch. It was a symbol of endurance. But Hans didn't stop there. In Rolex shop windows across Europe, jewelers displayed oysters submerged in fish tanks, running perfectly underwater. Crowds gathered in awe. Competitors shook their heads. Rolex had done it again, blending engineering with showmanship. The world had never seen a brand promote itself with such boldness. Rolex wasn't just selling watches, it was selling trust. By the late 1920s, Rolex was no longer just a name, it was a phenomenon. Every oyster that left the factory carried not just precision, but a story of survival, ambition, and belief in the impossible. And Hans Wilsdorf? He was just getting started. His next innovation wouldn't just make Rolex waterproof, it would make Rolex unstoppable. By the early 1930s, Rolex had conquered one frontier, water. But there was another problem. Watches still needed daily winding. Forget to wind yours, and your timepiece would stop. For businessmen, explorers, and athletes, this was more than inconvenient. Hans Wilsdorf knew the next challenge, a watch that powered itself. In 1931, Rolex unveiled a movement that would change watchmaking forever: the perpetual rotor. It was a tiny semicircular weight inside the watch that rotated with the motion of the wrist. Every step, every movement charged the mainspring. Suddenly the watch became alive, feeding on the energy of the wearer. No more winding, no more interruptions. This was the world's first truly reliable self-winding wristwatch. Competitors scoffed. "It's a gimmick," they said. "It won't last." But Rolex had learned something from the Oyster. Innovation meant nothing without proof. So they gave the Perpetual to mountaineers, aviators, and adventurers. It survived storms, dust, heat, and freezing cold. Everywhere it went, it kept ticking. And slowly, the skeptics went silent. Hans called it the Oyster Perpetual. The name said it all. A watch sealed like an oyster, running perpetually as long as you did. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a partner, a symbol of resilience and progress. By the mid-1930s, Rolex wasn't just surviving history, it was shaping it. Businessmen wore it to meetings, pilots wore it across continents, explorers wore it into the unknown. Every Oyster Perpetual was more than a timekeeper. It was a silent witness to ambition, risk, and discovery. And Hans Wilsdorf? He wasn't satisfied yet. His vision was even bigger. He didn't just want Rolex on wrists, he wanted Rolex in history books. By the mid-20th century, Rolex had proven itself in workshops, offices, and cities. But Hans Wilsdorf had a different dream. He wanted Rolex to be more than a timepiece. He wanted it to be a partner in human adventure, not just telling time, but keeping history. On May 29, 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay stood at the top of the world, Mount Everest. The air was thin, temperatures were brutal, every step could mean death. And on Hillary's wrist, a Rolex Oyster Perpetual. That ascent wasn't just a triumph of human courage. It was a validation of Rolex's durability. The watch survived the summit. It ticked without failing on the very roof of the Earth. If Everest was the sky, the ocean was the abyss. In 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste descended into the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth, nearly 11 kilometers below the surface. On the outside of the vessel, strapped to its hull, was a Rolex Deep Sea Special. The pressure was unimaginable. Steel could buckle, glass could shatter. But when the Trieste resurfaced, the Rolex was still ticking, unharmed, as if nothing had happened. And while explorers climbed mountains and plunged into oceans, another frontier was opening: the skies. The world was shrinking. Pilots flew across time zones. Travelers crossed continents in hours. In 1955, Rolex released the GMT Master for Pan Am pilots. It showed 2 time zones at once, home and destination. For the jet age, it wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. With Everest, the Mariana Trench, and the skies of the jet age, Rolex wasn't just along for the ride. It was writing itself into the human story of exploration. Rolex became more than a watch. It was a statement. Wherever humans dared to go, Rolex would go too. By the 1960s, Rolex was no longer just a watch for survival. It had become a watch for status. It wasn't only about keeping time anymore. It was about what that time said about you. In 1962, a suave British agent walked onto the screen. His name, Bond. James Bond. Sean Connery's Bond wore a Rolex Submariner. It wasn't product placement. It wasn't a marketing stunt. It was simply what a man of danger and elegance would wear. On Bond's wrist, Rolex wasn't just luxury. It was adventure. It was power. And that moment on screen cemented Rolex as the watch of choice for heroes, rebels, and legends. But Rolex didn't just belong to secret agents. It was on the wrists of champions. From Wimbledon's grass courts to Formula One's roaring tracks, Rolex became the official timekeeper of excellence. Athletes didn't just win trophies, they won with Rolex measuring every second. The brand became inseparable from precision, victory, and the thrill of competition. And beyond sports and movies, Rolex found its way to the corridors of power. Presidents, CEOs, visionaries, many wore Rolex not for the brand but for what it symbolized. Reliability, success, permanence. In boardrooms and in history books, Rolex was there, on the wrists of those who shaped the world. By the late 20th century, Rolex was no longer just a timepiece. It was a signal of taste, of accomplishment, of belonging to a class that demanded the best. And while the world around it changed, Rolex never chased trends. Instead, it became the trend, a quiet symbol of power, hiding in plain sight on the wrist. As the world entered the 21st century, luxury was everywhere. Designer handbags, exotic cars, expensive sneakers. But Rolex didn't just survive the flood of luxury, it rose above it. Unlike other brands, Rolex never increased production to meet demand. While millions wanted one, only a chosen few could have one. This wasn't by accident, it was strategy. Scarcity created desire. Waiting lists created obsession, and obsession created legends. The strategy worked so well that Rolex watches didn't just hold value, they grew. A Rolex wasn't just a purchase, it was an investment. Pre-owned markets exploded. Vintage models sold for more than new ones. Auctions saw record-breaking bids. And suddenly, owning a Rolex meant you weren't just wearing history, you were holding wealth on your wrist. In an era of flashy marketing and loud campaigns, Rolex stayed quiet. No gimmicks, no wild collaborations. Instead, Rolex perfected subtle innovation, stronger movements, improved waterproofing, better materials. Every upgrade invisible to the casual eye, but essential to those who knew. Rolex didn't scream for attention, it whispered, and the world listened. Today, Rolex is more than a watch, it's a phenomenon. Celebrities want it, collectors chase it, the world respects it. From Wall Street to Hollywood, from athletes to presidents, Rolex sits untouchable, above the noise, above the hype. Because Rolex doesn't follow culture, it defines it. From a small workshop in London, to the peak of Mount Everest, to the wrist of James Bond, and now to the vaults of collectors worldwide. Rolex is no longer just a timekeeper, it is time itself, immortalized. So, what can we learn from Rolex? How did a small workshop in London, making simple watches, become the most powerful name in luxury? The answer isn't luck, it's strategy, it's vision, it's obsession with perfection. Rolex never innovated just to impress. Every feature, from waterproofing to self-winding to stronger steel, solved a real problem. Innovation wasn't noise, it was necessity, and that's why every improvement mattered. When demand grew, Rolex could have flooded the market. But it didn't. By limiting supply, Rolex turned watches into symbols of exclusivity. Because in luxury, not everyone having one is exactly what makes everyone want one. For over a century, Rolex stayed true to its DNA. No sudden rebrands, no desperate marketing tricks. Instead, timeless design, slow evolution, and flawless quality. That consistency turned Rolex into more than a brand. It became a legacy, unlike others chasing headlines. Rolex mastered silence, no screaming ads, no viral gimmicks. Instead, it let its watches, and the people who wore them, tell the story. Presidents, explorers, champions. Every wrist became a billboard of success. Today, Rolex is more than just a company. It's proof that true greatness comes not from rushing, but from patience, precision, and perfection. From humble beginnings to untouchable luxury, Rolex didn't just measure time, it defined it. And maybe that's the real lesson. Don't chase the moment. Build something that lasts forever.